Hey man, welcome back to Three-Peat Sports. I am your host, Ian Monhay. This is episode 19, and I hope you guys are doing well. I myself am doing pretty well. I just got off of school yesterday, and that means I have a whole lot of time to watch a lot of basketball and produce a lot of content. And you don't know how excited I am for this month-long break. But again, I hope you guys are doing well. I appreciate you all who are listening on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to your podcast. But for this episode, I would strongly recommend to go watch on YouTube. For the first time in a long time, I'm joined by a guest. His name is Stephen. He's also known as StayTrueSDot3 on Twitter. And for about a half hour, we had a conversation about the Phoenix Suns, how their defense has performed, and what we expect their defense to become as the season goes on. And to help us with that conversation, we ended up looking at a couple of clips, a little bit of film to back up our points. So, and what would be described as a film analysis. And for the nerds, I guess you could say, this is going to be the episode for you because he is in on all the basketball terminology in the world that I'm still learning. Like he is a step above me in terms of just knowing the game. And that's why I'm very excited for it because he's such a smart basketball mind. And we had a very fun conversation about the Phoenix Suns defense. And again, I suggest you going to the YouTube and watching this conversation instead of listening. I won't lie, like that beginning part of the conversation, I was definitely a little bit nervous, not necessarily because I had a guest on. It's more so trying to go through with this episode without having to stutter and trying to be perfect the entire time. It was definitely new trying to share my screen and go back and forth between me sharing my screen and him sharing his screen. It was definitely different for sure. And I had to make sure to reiterate his name in this introduction because I definitely almost fumbled the bag and messed up his name at the beginning of the conversation. But that's besides the point. I know that you guys probably want to listen to that, and I'll make just this part very quick. The in-season tournament has been so damn fun. I am recording on December 5th, so yesterday was the beginning of the knockout rounds of the in-season tournament, and you could just tell that there's just a certain energy that is much different in November, December than in previous years, and I know that's been hammered home time and time again by plenty of fans, but I got to give credit to one of my guys, Will. He has been on that train for such a long time, just that the in-season tournament is going to work and that this is a great thing for the NBA. I myself was definitely skeptical at that time, but I think it was more so I wasn't expecting the stars to care as much as they have so far, and that's kind of looking at it short-sighted. But at the end of the day, $500,000 for the winner is $500,000, and you could just tell that the players sort of rally around that, especially for the players that are not earning that max money. They want to get that money. They want to help their teammates that aren't making as much to get that money. And I think there is definitely a little bit more incentive to these games, and they're playing hard with these games, and that's just been such a fun part. And then you go ahead and you look at the small market teams that are in the in-season tournament right now, particularly with Indiana. They just knocked off the Celtics and they're going to Vegas to compete in this tournament. And it gave so many of those players a bigger spotlight than they have had in recent years. I think that was Tyrese Halliburton's first national television game. And it's just so crazy to me that it took that long to do so. And I mean, he fucking performed. He was really, really good. And I'm all in on this in-season tournament. And now I'm probably going to be very pissed no matter the outcome tonight versus the Suns-Lakers game. And I'm sure a lot of that is going to apply to this conversation that I have with Steven here. Again, I recorded this exactly a week ago. Today's December 5th. I can't remember what day last week was, but it was a really good conversation. the Suns were ranked 18th in defensive rating at that time. I guess in the meantime, I'll look up the Suns' defensive rating right now. But I would assume, like, over a week of play, that something is definitely maybe different. Where are they at? They definitely are still around that same mark. I might just be tripping. They are still 18th. Okay. So nothing has changed right there. So it definitely still applies a week later. And I'm just excited for you guys to listen to it. And, without further ado, let's get into our conversation with Stephen Gardner. And joining me today, we have one of my favorite follows on Twitter. We got StayTrueSDot3. We got Stephen. My man, welcome to the show. Appreciate you for joining.
I appreciate you having me, man. I've never turned down the opportunity to talk hoop.
Oh, me neither. Me neither. I'm still waiting for more of those opportunities, unlike yourself. But today it's going to be pretty simple, right? This is the first episode for this podcast. And because I follow the Suns and you're a consistent contributor for sites like Bright Side of the Sun and PHNX and the amount of content that you create for that's Suns related, I figured that we would talk about the defense. Now, I definitely want to get to the Suns very soon, but I think I wanted to start off with who is Frank Vogel as a defensive head coach? What are like the basic principles and the basic schemes that you see from him as he has coached throughout the last several years?
Well, I think the thing that's consistently aligned with Frank Vogel-led teams that are successful defensively, even before anything on the court, they're always well prepared. And even past being well prepared, they're also well disciplined within their schemes, and specifically even past schemes. If you look at scouting reports and understanding players' pet moves, what you want to take away, and how to do that in specific areas of the floor over the course of a 24-second shot clock, and then adjusting even more so over the course of a game on the fly. His teams are usually in that top third of the league in terms of who's most prepared, who's most disciplined, and who's able to consistently execute upon the scouting report that's been prepared from the head coach and also, of course, from scouts and things like that. So in his brain trust is always those three qualities, and they always pretty much put forth that same thing on film, looking at how the team performs. And if you want to kind of look a little bit more like scheme-wise, he typically runs a slightly more conservative defense, typically keeping his bigs closer to the paint and closer to the rim and drop coverage. And I think what's distinct about his teams is that they always have at least one elite level dogged point of attack defender that always sets the tone and keeps the defensive shell intact on the perimeter. So if you look at the championship winning team with the Lakers, it was Alex Caruso. And he always has at least a player like that on his roster, in addition to wing players that have size to get in passing lanes and disrupt driving angles and things like that.
Yeah, I was gonna mention mainly like the bigs. I've always been intrigued with that, and I think everybody was intrigued with that when they first hired Frank. Was how were they going to develop DeAndre Ayton, and now it's how are they going to incorporate Yusuf Nurkic with his physical and athletic disadvantages on that end. What do you view? Do you view the big man as like the most important position within that defensive scheme?
Honestly, no. And I think that's also kind of falls like hand in hand with the evolution of the NBA. I don't think that you can state a value for just how important rim, just protecting the rim in general, rim protection is. But I do think that the playing field in terms of what's valued most is starting to be a little bit more evened out. And we could see that with most recently Marcus Smart winning the Defensive Player of the Year award as a perimeter defender, obviously one of the most greedy and stingy point of attack defenders of all time. I think the value is starting to increase because of the influx of guards and perimeter oriented players. And obviously 3 being more than 2 and everything that comes with that math wise and analytically. I think that the most important thing in a Frank Vogel led defense is indeed that point of attack defense. And you can see it in the film when the point of attack defense is sharp. Everything else falls in line behind that. The shell stays intact. They're able to get stops and deflections and steals and all those type of things When it's not there or when it's iffy, that's when we start seeing a mixed bag of uneven results.
Right. And I was going to say that same thing because I still wanted to connect this to that Lakers championship team a couple of years ago. And this is where I'm going to try to pull up my first clip. Granted, like I'm not, in terms of like the terminology, I'm not up to par with what you guys are. This is my first time doing this sort of thing. So let me share my screen real quickly. We'll go entire screen. All right, so I went into something like this, right? This was a Lakers and Utah game, and it's just very simple with a little bit more of a higher drop where he's not necessarily at the level Anthony Davis, but he's at least there enough to where he can cover up enough ground and still be able to catch up to his man. And I think that in some ways, that's kind of how I view. That's why I view the big man as such an important piece, at least for a Frank Vogel defense. I just think that there is a lot of court awareness. There's a lot of traits, tedious traits that Frank Vogel really likes. And as we continue to watch the rest of this play, you're going to see a pass go down to Rudy Gobert and Anthony Davis able to make up a ton of that ground. Granted, he's such an amazing, what would you call it? He's such an amazing rim protector, right? But is ultimately, let me stop the sharing real quick. He's ultimately a guy that I think is, I think that Frank Vogel-led defenses really appreciate having bigs like that can just be so schematically versatile and understand all of these schemes and be most court aware at all times. That was kind of the point that I was trying to make.
Yeah, and you are 110% correct in that. I don't think that, again, like I said, you can place a value on just how important rim protection is. But just kind of looking at what the defense that Frank Vogel likes to run is at his template in drop coverage, regardless of the depth of the drop of the big man, everything is kind of catered or teetered to how effective whoever that guard is that's navigating screens is at just keeping things intact in terms of staying in front of his man or staying attached to the ball. At his premise, drop coverage is essentially making the pick and roll a 2-on-2, excluding help defenders and trying to keep yourself out of rotation as much as possible. So kind of in that, if we imagine Nurkic and let's say Josh Okogie in a pick and roll 2-man game, when that guard comes off the screen, it's all on Josh Okogie to do as much as he can to either stay attached to the hip or stay attached to the backside and fight his way back into the play. They don't want to typically involve an extra player or even switch, but obviously in most situations in the NBA with how elite players are and the angles of screens like and things of that nature, that kind of makes it a little muddy with that. So that's where the chemistry between those two comes into play. But at its premise, drop coverage is to keep the shell intact, keep other players from being involved outside of the two directly involved in action, and for that guard to be great at navigating over the screen and staying in the play. So that's just kind of my philosophy, just kind of looking at the premise of that. And then looking at the pieces involved for the Suns, they like to keep the guards away from getting to Nurkic as much as possible. And the best way to keep your guards or keep your opposing guards from doing that is in drop coverage, unless you're hedging, of course.
Of course. And I was going to mention just this one last thing that I was mainly watching from the Lakers tape. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Alex Caruso, and I also really thought about Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and how they were playing. I viewed them a little bit more so. It seems like their anticipation was through the roof. Like I saw them switching. I saw them scram switching really early. And it seems it's anticipation through preparation. And I think I have a clip. So, is it this one? Yeah, it is. It's going to go by. Oh, shoot. Let me share my screen real quickly. Still getting used to this stuff.
Yes, sir. You good? You good?
Let's go to the entire screen once again. So I had so many clips, but we're just going to try to go through a couple because I don't want to take up too much time here.
For sure.
But it's going to go by real quickly. KCP, obviously, in that corner spot, is already helping really early, which is just like normal defensive coverage, sure, but I think it's just the reaction time. You look at a lot of the off-ball players that they have had throughout those guys' throughout Frank Vogel's career. You have KCP, you have Caruso, you have Avery Bradley, you have guys that are able to close space real quickly, when it
Mhm.
comes to those real skip passes or when they
Mhm.
are helping off of drives. And I noticed that with Eric Gordon as a guy that has helped out quite a bit. Um, when his guy is in the corner and there's a drive coming in, he helps out maybe a little too far to the point where he might not be able to catch up to the guy that's in the corner, and he gets a little bit more of an open shot than we would like. Now, I looked up the defensive rating as of today. It is at 18th in the NBA. Uh, is it matching the eye test to you? And where have you seen like the most growth on the defensive end so far to begin the year?
I don't think that 18th matches what I'm at least what I'm seeing on film, or even more so what I feel when I'm watching the team. Especially obviously over the last 2.5 weeks with the 7 game win streak. Um, just to kind of look at specifically with the numbers on the season, on cleaning the glass, they keep up with the same thing that you were talking about with defensive rating. They just exclude garbage time and then those heaves at the end of quarters and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So it just kind of really extrapolates like the fat from it, and it just gets straight to the point for you statistically. On the season, they're at 114.4, which is 17th, which is essentially the number that you just mentioned to us.
Mm-hmm.
In the half court specifically, that number drops to 14th, and they're at a 96.1 in terms of their rating. And then remembering those two numbers specifically in this win streak, that number of 114.4 is at 119.2 now with their rating. So that would be 22nd in this window for about a week and a half. Um, but looking specifically in the half court, that number of 96.1 remains relatively the same at 96.4. And
Mm-hmm.
that number ranks 10th. So that's a top third effective defense in the half court, which is really where you want to be, especially
Yeah.
when you have the offensive firepower that they have. So it kind of matches the eye test, but I do feel like they're being more effective specifically in the fourth quarters, which is where we saw a lot of the blunders and the miscommunications and the lapses of execution within the scheme, really
Mm-hmm.
hurting them in games like against the Lakers and in games against like Oklahoma City and games like those where they had leads in the fourth quarter, which they've had a lead in almost every game in the fourth quarter this season, and they just haven't been able to close it out. Um, and just kind of what I'm seeing on film, I think was your second question.
Mm-hmm.
It's been more than anything when you have so many new pieces in rotation, you have to ingratiate those pieces together. So there's a natural period where players are trying to figure out tendencies of one another, figuring out, okay, this is the scheme, this is the template they want us to execute upon. But how do I go about doing that with this player who might not be as athletic as the player that replaces them? If we're talking about Nurkic and Eubanks, and vice versa with the big man and the guards slash forwards. We know Kevin Durant is not going to be a better screen navigator than Josh Okogie. So if you're in drop coverage and it's Kevin Durant, you have to be more on your toes in terms of when there's going to be a late switch versus giving a little bit more credence for letting that guard work through it if it's Josh Okogie or if it's Jordan Goodwin. So it's just been a lot of little moments like that, and even past drop coverage when they go back into their switching schemes is what specifically would hurt them. I've mentioned the game against the Lakers where they typically, as they did in the playoffs last season, and really what got them to the playoffs through the play-in round was the two-man game of Austin Reeves and LeBron James. Austin Reeves being the screener for LeBron in an inverted pick and roll. Oftentimes teams are going to be forced to switch that. If your switching is not on par in terms of the communication that's needed and the timeliness in which it's needed, and also the technique in it, and not just passing the baton off to one another, but being physical and pushing guys to the legal limit, of course, to where you're dictating and you're not just allowing them to pass off to one another. That's what was kind of missing, in addition to the drop coverage things I spoke on. And they've really shored up a lot of those things in this recent stretch. And that's a large reason why they're seeing the results they have been.
I am a little curious with particularly with Bates Diop as a guy that I keep up with Suns Twitter quite a bit. I see the overreactions of right, all right, he moves a little bit like Kawhi, right? But there is something about particularly in that Chicago game where he was closing out that game. If you remember, that was Bradley Beal's first game. Unfortunately, I don't have any clips of any Bates Diop. I was mainly trying to highlight Nurk and Eubanks, but is there something that needs to be tapped in a little bit more with his overall defensive game? Because I feel like there's a little bit more potential to utilize him in bigger rotation minutes.
Yeah, I think with KBD and Frank Vogel has mentioned a few times in pregame and postgame that they're going to cycle through different lineups in terms of who's that fifth starter, just to get a volume of film on tape versus varying teams, and just to get an understanding of who fits best against what specific types of opponents. So, for example, obviously when they played the Bulls, like you mentioned, it was KBD that got the start over Josh Okogie, and that's because KBD was going to be specifically tasked with guarding DeMar DeRozan. Now, the way the Bulls are set up, they have a threat as far as a scorer at point guard, but it's not the realm of a Jamal Murray or even potentially like a Jalen Brunson. So that matchup specifically suited itself, especially with the areas of the floor where DeMar DeRozan likes to operate from. That's better suited itself for KBD to start. And I mean, he had a very impressive showing. DeMar DeRozan had one of his worst games of the season, and it wasn't because he was cold.
Yeah.
KBD was doing a great job being physical to the legal limit, pushing him off his initial spots, getting up solid contests on his jump shots, not falling for the pump fakes, which is one of the hardest things. And I actually had the pleasure of talking to KBD after the game, and
Nice.
he mentioned the biggest thing with DeMar is all mental. Like, yes, he's an athlete. Yes, he can create space with his dribble, but it's all about being disciplined because he's a counter puncher. And once you start giving him aggression, which you typically do because he's an elite scorer, that's when he starts countering with these head fakes and the nasty footwork that he has. And KBD mentioned that having spent the season with him in San Antonio, a season that really changed DeMar DeRozan's career in terms of him being able to add years to his career with his playmaking. KBD said he spent a lot of time guarding him at practice, learning tools of the trade, and ultimately helping to make him a better defender. And in that is the main thing is just the focus discipline wise. And that comes back to, again, being over prepared from your head coach with scouting reports and things like that. KBD simply executed a scout report and then also took the prior knowledge that he had of DeMar and added it in real time, and we saw the results of that. So I do agree with you. I think there's more to be unlocked with KBD, but I think it's all also going to just be dependent upon who they're matching up with, especially come playoff time.
Sure, because it's certainly the shooting that has to go up a notch a little bit. I don't have the stats right here, but I do think that he's shooting like sub 36% from downtown. I
Yeah,
hope I'm right on that.
it hasn't been the
Um,
prettiest start for him offensively. That's for
sure.
sure.
From that standpoint, I remember DeRozan talking about Torrey Craig being the most difficult matchup and him knowing his tendencies. That's sort of where I always go back from. If he can become this sort of Torrey Craig level defender, then I think we're in a pretty decent spot. Especially if he could get his jump shot off.
I honestly feel that KBD is, and ultimately we'll obviously see that play out as this season goes on, especially as the games grow more meaningful and specifically in the playoffs. I think that he's of that ilk and of that realm of defense in terms of just being disciplined. He might not be as active, and obviously being active defensively comes with foul trouble, which we saw with Torrey Craig in the playoffs last season. KBD isn't going to make some of those quote unquote mistakes just because he's more disciplined. He doesn't take as many risks as Torrey Craig does defensively, but also the trade off with that is KBD is a better 3-point shooter than Torrey Craig is on consistency. We saw Torrey Craig knock down, was it 14, 15 of his first like 20 or 22 3-point attempts in that first round series against the Clippers through the
Yeah.
first like 4 games. And then in that 5th game and going into that Nuggets series, he couldn't hit the side of a barn standing from the front door, you know. So that's no slight at Torrey, but that just speaks to the volatility that comes with a player like Torrey Craig, where there's more of a steadiness that comes with having someone like K-Base Diab. And I think that ultimately is going to definitely help the Suns optimize this roster they have this season, especially defensively.
Yeah, granted, they only shot what 9 of 50 from all corner 3-point attempts in that Denver series. I mean, nobody was having a good shooting series outside of your two stars. Um, I only have a couple more things here. I did want to highlight a couple of things because I do think that as we have gone about this this notion that Nurkic isn't a great defensive big, and to some extent, like I think we can all understand the deficiencies uh, from from an athletic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were just to look at a play like this, I believe this is the play where, yeah, simple drop coverage and just great verticality on a guy like Shaden Sharp,
Mm-hmm.
where you'd certainly you fear a matchup like that. You really don't want him jumping with a guy like that. And it's just great technique. It's great alteration. And it's something that we've also seen with a guy like Drew Eubanks, who has excelled a little bit more on a higher drop than
Mm-hmm.
Nurkic. But it's awesome verticality. And those guys need to be spotlighted a little bit more, a little bit better, because they have become underrated in that aspect by Suns fans because of the previous notions that, hey, we don't have very good defending bigs.
Well said. Well said. And I think there's beauty in having contrast in your front court pieces. You don't want them to necessarily play exactly the same. You want to be able to give a different flavor so that, especially when you're a contending team, when you get into playing multiple schemes over the course of 48 minutes, you have multiple types of chess pieces you can put on the board to dictate and keep yourself in the position of making your opponents guess. That's where the best teams are in terms of what they can give and what they can show. You look at the Milwaukee Bucks, for example. Bobby Portis is a different defender from what Giannis is, and Giannis is a different defender from what Brook Lopez is. All three of
Mhm.
them in one harmony bring you multiple schemes that you can execute over the course of 48 minutes. And that alone just puts them in a position of dictating. Giannis can play drop. Giannis can play at the level of the screen and hedge out. Giannis can also switch. Bobby Portis can do all three in the same at different levels than Giannis can. And Brook Lopez, obviously, he's more edged towards playing drop coverage, but occasionally he can get up to the level of the screen. And that's where you really start speeding up ball handlers and making them guess. And when you can ultimately keep teams from turning the corner with their guards, and then you have guards that can stick with them navigating around screens, that's where you can get yourself a top third of the league defense to match with the offense that's going to definitely be top 5 by the end of the season.
Yeah, well said right there. Again, I would say only about two more things that I have for this episode that I have.
For sure.
I think I wanted to mention Book real quickly. Um, Again, early in his career, it was always the draft notions of he was only a shooter, and that was all he could do. He couldn't really defend, and that really has, for some reason, stuck with people. But he does have his lapses for sure. There is one, I think it was very early in the Golden State game, yeah, where it's just a matter of falling asleep. It's nothing too much analytical other than, he's just got to wake up. Maybe a better closeout would be nice if you were to be technical with it. But again, I think with a player like that, that's going to exert as much energy as he does offensively, he's going to want a couple of plays off on the defensive end from time to time. But we look at a play in the New York game near the end of the game where he has to close out on an Emmanuel Quickly, who has a unique jumper, a jumper that you would look at maybe like a high schooler, where it's a lot underneath the arm. It's very quick. He jumps pretty high as well. And I
Mhm.
thought that it was impressive that from that elbow to that, wing between the corner spot, he was able to close the gap and ultimately get a block on that play. In terms of Book's defensive potential, maybe just his overall archetype, how do you envision Book improving even more on that defensive end? Because I think just with the little stuff like that, if he was able to exert a little bit more energy on that end, I think he could be in that cusp of being one of the top tier defenders at that guard position.
So I give him a little bit of a pass in moments because of what he shows in other moments over the course of 48 minutes. I think that where with a lot of the elite guards in today's NBA, you have to worry about them defensively in terms of if they can hold up. I don't think that I can say confidently that I know that I don't worry about Devin Booker not knowing what to do in defensive context. B,
Right.
his effort is never in question. And C, his ability to execute. Like those are all three different like realms and dynamics of being a good defender. I think he has all of those in spades. Obviously, like the clip you showed early in the game against the Golden State Warriors, there's no excuse for losing track of Klay Thompson of all people on the court. The Warriors are gonna always be in constant movement. So even if you're not gonna be chasing him all over the floor, you have to be in communication with somebody else so that can be covered. That's a no. That's non-negotiable. He'll tell you that himself.
Yeah.
But I don't have that worry with Devin Booker, and I keep going back to the playoffs last season because that's when you really start to see who's who and who's what. And we saw him not only be the best offensive player through the first two series in the entire playoffs, he was also an absolutely elite guard on the defensive side of the floor. You look at what he was doing defensively, navigating screens, defending against Jamal Murray at times, defending against insert any Clippers guard here. Sometimes it was Russell Westbrook. Sometimes it was literally anybody else. He was just consistently executing, not just on the ball, but off the ball. That rep that you showed was on the in terms of him being in help and rotating defensively. We saw him sprinting across the floor, getting deflections and steals galore in that series against the Clippers. I think that's his ceiling. He'll never be Kawhi Leonard or Paul George or anybody
Sure.
of that ilk, but I think he can be an above average defender on any given night, and more often than not, he is that. So, in terms of the level of worry or trust that I have in Devin Booker, the trust is absolutely high just because of what we saw in the playoffs and even what we saw in the finals run that the Suns had even before then. That was 2 years prior. They don't get there if he's not solid defensively, and he was that and then some against the likes of Paul George and things like that over that run.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to allude that he was this.
For sure.
He's still this bad defender.
For sure, but people
And I know that
they don't watch him consistently. I know
right.
you.
But I certainly get that. And maybe like I'm pushing it in terms of elite, right? And everybody has their own definition of elite, but he's certainly it certainly feels like he could take another level up from that. Last thing before I let you go, again, we're at 18th in defensive rating. Everybody's gonna continue to have these questions about the Suns, even if it's the national pundits that's supposed to be watching the best teams every day. How are you going to determine a successful defensive season from them? Is it's going to be from the rankings, from the defensive rating? Is it going to be specific execution that you're going to be looking for? How would you measure their own defensive success?
I think the best way to do so is to marry what you're seeing live, what you're seeing on film, and also using the stats to either support your claim or to prove your claim wrong. So for me, it's going to be at the end of the season, can they get to top 12 in defensive rating? If they can get to top 12 in defensive rating, I think they're in more than solid standing just because of the pace that they play at, the amount of possessions, and the amount of scoring that they can compile over the course of 48 minutes. Most teams won't be able to keep up with them if they're playing a game at their pace, especially. So if they're able to get to a top or close to a top third defense come the season's end, I think that's a successful season, and that's something that they can build off of. How they get there, there's a few different ways. I think the best way to get there is going to be through scheme versatility. And we talked about Nurkic's limitations at times. I have some clips, if you don't mind me showing, where Nurkic was in the most recent game against the New York Knicks, just a great defender in drop coverage. And we can see here on his first play. Actually, this one's gonna be with Eubanks. We'll have one coming with Nurkic shortly.
Gotcha.
But this first play here, just look at the Suns, as I mentioned, some of the issues with their switching. And in terms of just looking at where they are with their communication and how sharp they are, we see one switch here, a late switch here between Eubanks and Devin Booker. He goes over the force quickly to get downhill. They communicate.
I'm sorry to interrupt real quickly.
Yes, sir.
I can't see the screen.
Oh no. Okay, I forgot to hit the. Got you. There we go. Let's see. Share screen. There we go. Boom. All right. Can you see it now?
No, I cannot.
What about now?
I can see it. There we go.
You know? Yeah. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right. Cool. So his first clip here is gonna be with Drew Eubanks. So we're gonna see them obviously in drop coverage with him. It's gonna be Emmanuel quickly coming off a handoff that falls into a screen. You see Devin Booker here is gonna force him to go downhill by giving him an over. That's gonna force him into Drew Eubanks. And look at the switch here. This was an issue that they were having earlier in the season. They will ultimately put two to the ball here. Devin Booker will still be chasing. Eubanks will obviously be trying to help him over. That will open up the roller, or that would pull Watanabe off of his man, RJ Barrett, as he shakes up. That would be either a wide open three or a layup opportunity to the roller. But this time, looking at where they are in terms of ingratiating their chemistry and things like that, they're a lot more connected, and look at the communication from the back line and everything else that's going on. They end up sending a double team. That's going to flatten out the action. Now they're late in the shot clock, and Devin Booker's going to be solid here. And they're ultimately going to end up getting a stop as Watanabe rotates back out and gets a solid contest. It's just little things like this that they weren't doing earlier in the season that they are doing now that's really just changing how the defense feels and how it looks on film, and also how effective it is with the numbers. And then here's going to be a rep with Nurkic. So as I started from the beginning, we're going to see him here with the Koji at the point of attack. We're going to see the Knicks get into some pistol action. And look at the Koji at the point of attack, setting the tone defensively, flattening out action, and then ultimately speeding it up as he forces the redirect. And now we mentioned with Eubanks and Devin Booker on the last rep that late switch and drop coverage. We're going to see a little bit more of that here. And looking at how close to each other and how on the same page Nurkic and Okogie are here. As we see one more time, the late switch part of it, he crosses back over on the snake screen. That's automatically going to be a telltale sign for Nurkic to take over. And then Okogie is going to fall back into the legs of the roller. And all of this is being done at a high pace. So just looking at Nurkic, as we talked about with him having limitations, being able to stick with guards, rotating all over the floor. And then ultimately it's going to flow into a late clock stop for the Suns as Okogie comes over to help him. These are the little things that they just weren't getting earlier in the season that they are now. And it's just making the defense seem like night and day at this point.
Yeah. Shoot, I'm personally in like the top 15 of defensive rating in terms of that. Mm-hmm. I think that if we were able, for it to be in the top 12, I think it's going to be a lot more Okogie minutes. But I understand he has to hit his open shots. That's the only way that he's going to really get on the floor. And I know that's as cliche of a Suns line as it can get, but that's really what it is. If he begins hitting those wide open shots, he's a $15 million a year player because he is that special defensively and is going to impact very good defensive possessions night in, night out.
I think that's well said. I do think that one thing to look at in terms of Okogie and when he's getting his minutes and not making shots versus when Vogel goes elsewhere, I think the spade in Vogel's back pocket right now is Jordan Goodwin. Now, he doesn't have the big game playoff moments that Okogie has in terms of experience quite yet, but we've seen already through this first handful of games, and especially over the 7-game win streak, that Jordan Goodwin is fighting, scratching, and clawing to hold on to his spot within the rotation. Now, he's had a couple of games where his minutes have dropped and he's been low on that end, but when he's been given opportunities, he's been consistently executing on what he's being brought in to do, which is defend. Yeah. And he's doing all the little things. Like we talked about screen navigation so much. That's one of the most important things that any guard in the NBA can have. And that's truly a skill just as much as being able to handle the ball under pressure is on the offensive side. Being able to navigate screens, it does so much for your defense in terms of keeping guys in their positions without breaking the shell. Jordan Goodwin, in addition to Okogie, is someone that excels at that, is elite at that. But something that Okogie doesn't have that Jordan Goodwin does have, in addition to the screen navigation, is his hands. His hands are as active as, and I'm speaking to the Chris Paul that was on the Phoenix Suns. His hands are as good as Phoenix Suns Chris Paul's were in terms of just getting in on passes or dribble moves that you wouldn't expect somebody to, and especially and help even more so than on the ball. He has great anticipatory skills, almost like a free safety in football, and he's able to jump cuts and just wreak havoc and cause chaos on the defensive side. And again, when you speak to a team that's contending, we talked about Frank Vogel's teams always having at least one nasty point of attack defender. He has two of those. Now, granted, they're not as playable as Alex Caruso was on that Lakers team. They could potentially work up to that this season, but at this point in time, they aren't that. So figuring out how to get them to that point, or obviously finding it elsewhere, is going to be important. But at this point in time right now, they have it in those two, and I think that's why it's so important that those two are used within the rotation in an alternating fashion over the course of maybe 36 minutes, giving them about 14, 15, 16 each, something like that. And then just kind of playing it out the rest of the way from there. But keeping one of those players on the floor up until crunch time is going to be important for this team.
I've always been in the camp of like bringing in more youth, more young talent, especially when they had McHale, when they had Cam, just
Mhm.
having a little bit more of a youth resurgence instead of having a lot of the Chris Pauls of the world. And I know I'm forgetting a couple of guys that were on the team last year, but I was in the boat for particularly a guy like Vanderbilt or a guy like Rui Hachimura, all on the same team now. But you get the point. Just having somebody that can develop and somebody that's a little bit more of a project. And I think having Goodwin as the project, I'm in agreement with you that like it's really nasty having a guy that's 6'3", 6'10" wingspan with that type of tenacity. It's going to be real special if he's able to consistently hit at this 35% 3-point clip, because that was the one thing that I saw is that it's just a Josh Okogie with as at the point guard position, and he's certainly showing himself and proving his worth as the season has gone on because he's hit some pretty big shots for this team.
Yeah, for sure. And you can look at the last two games. He's got up to 14 points while playing very relevant minutes in both of those games as well. On the road against Memphis and obviously on the road at New York on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Especially and specifically in those fourth quarters where he's coming away with clutch buckets. Multiple knockdowns from deep and a couple of plays playing off of Devin Booker, getting offensive rebounds and things of that nature. He is really, really impressing me. And if this could continue, that's going to change a lot of what this team feels like they might need to address via trades and buyout market and things like that.
Right. And that's really all that I have. I'll give you this opportunity to shout out your socials, where they can find you, where they can find your great content.
I appreciate you, man. Yeah, again, my name is Stephen. You can follow me on Twitter at StayTrueSDot3. Any of my work is funneled through there in terms of pubbing it and just generally creating content and posting it on there. And from there, you can also find my link tree in my bio, and that's where you can find all of my other content from YouTube to my written work on the NBA side and the WNBA side. Film sessions galore on both sides of basketball on my YouTube page, and podcast appearances and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, all of my stuff can be found on the link tree. I'll spare you the 30 minutes without me diving into all of that because I got a lot going on. But
Yeah.
yeah, you find me on Twitter, man. Follow me there. You'll see all of my stuff either there or on my link tree in my bio.
Y'all heard it here first. Go follow him, my man. And again, that is the episode. I really appreciate you guys listening to this week's episode of Three-Peat Sports. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And I look forward to talking more ball with you guys soon.